Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm taking a look at Silver Surfer. He is one of the characters that was most highly anticipated to get a tier 4 with this update, considering that it was an Annihilators themed update, and he is one of the characters that is part of that team. And lo and behold, he got a new uniform and a tier 4. Silver Surfer already had some of the best abilities in the game for PvP specifically. He had the debuff leadership, a self-revive, an iframe ignore with the counter as well, and reflect. His only issue was that his AI wasn't really that great, it didn't prioritize his skills properly, and that now his stats kind of fell off a little bit because of the introduction of the tier 4 stat bump. However, with the latest uniform and the tier 4 upgrade, all of those issues have basically been resolved, and the character is arguably now in the top 3 for the PvP meta as one of the best characters in the game for PvP across basically all modes. Because the character is so powerful and dominant in PvP with his latest upgrades, it doesn't make sense just to showcase how good he is, but also ways to consistently counter him. So closer to the end of the video, I also look at ways to counter him in things like Timeline, as well as in Alliance Conquest and potentially Otherworld Battle. I'm going to try to run through the PvE part of the review a little bit quicker because I don't really think he's that great for that mode. He is just way too dominant in PvP to have much value in PvE, and even then he doesn't really do that great with his current kit. Jumping straight into the testing, you can already see what I mean by this. Without a leadership, support, or a damage proc, I did stage 35 of Null, and he wasn't really able to complete the first phase within that 2-minute window to get under the 30 bars of health, meaning that he can't really complete this stage as is. For reference further in the video, I also did a stage 79 of Null, this time adding in a leadership and support, but again with no damage proc, and the character still couldn't get to that 30 health bar mark within the 2-minute window, let alone 3 minutes. I would highly advise not building this character for PvE. However, if you just don't care about PvP, then a CTP of Rage is easily a good option like it is for most characters. It really helps with his ultimate skill since it has a lot of delay on it and lingering attacks. However, you can definitely also make something like a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction work because the character is largely proc friendly. Again, I would highly recommend not building him for PvE, and you can already see from this particular clip, even at level 80, he struggles to complete the first phase within that 2-minute window, completing it with just 20 seconds left over. And for reference, if you watched my beta raid build video, that character was able to complete the first phase in 30 seconds, and the fight entirely within 2 minutes outright. Similarly, he doesn't do that well versus Mephisto either. He struggles to complete the first phase within that 1-minute window to guarantee that he can complete this fight entirely. No surprise he doesn't do that much better versus Ultron. It takes him about 2 minutes to complete the first phase or reach that 20 health bar mark, so he can't really complete the fight entirely versus him either. His performance versus Gore is just as bad. It took me about 2 minutes and 30 seconds to complete the first phase, which means that he can't complete this fight entirely at level 80. Looking at his tier 4 advancement, if or when you're able to upgrade him, he gets a massive improvement to his health, increasing by over 30,000, and roughly around a 20,000 energy attack increase, which is actually very substantial considering that his reflect is also based on it, so you basically double dip in the benefit that you get from it, not only increasing his attack across the board for all of his skills, but also his reflect for things like PvP. In terms of the strikers to use for PvE, characters like Thor and Beta Ray Bill will probably provide the most improvement since they are really good offensively and they also have the matching instinct type. You can also go with Ghost Rider. He doesn't have the matching instinct type, but is also a very good PvE-centered striker. The benefit of Ghost Rider is that he also doubles as a PvP striker. However, Surfer's best option there would likely be Wolverine, since he has the matching instinct type. You could also go with characters like Spider-Man or Hulk, since those are really good options as well, because they have the penetration and iframe ignore as a striker skill. You can see from this clip that the tier 4 shaved off about 1 minute and 40 seconds from the clear time of the first phase, and then he was able to complete the stage entirely with around 2 minutes left over. Versus Mephisto, he clears the first phase 20 seconds faster and is able to complete the fight entirely with a bit over 1 minute and 20 seconds left. Versus Ultron, the first phase is reached 40 seconds faster and the fight completed entirely with almost 30 seconds left over. On the Gore stage, he had the biggest improvement, clearing the first phase a minute faster than before. However, like I said, his PvE performance isn't really that great, and even with a tier 4 skill, I wasn't able to complete this stage entirely and had 6 health bars left over when the time ran out. I tested him in ABX at level 70 and at tier 4. He's not really going to be that great here. Not only is he missing things like burn for ABX and snare and shock for ABL, but he also doesn't have too many hits because his third skill isn't really going to be used at all. It's just going to be cancelled right away, so you're already missing hits from that. But on top of that, he's also missing skill damage and bonus damage in his kit, so that hurts him even further. The score you see here pretty much reinforces what I'm saying. I wasn't even able to score 9 million. Similar characters can hit past 9 million, close to 9.3 million. And then when I took him to tier 4, I was barely able to hit a little bit over 10 million, whereas characters with the tier 4 and the strikers and everything are able to hit closer to 11 million. Besides this, the universal villain restriction is pretty much dominated by either Loki or Jean Grey, so you're not really going to get value out of him here. His performance doesn't get any better in ABL. I only went a little bit past the halfway mark, and the character wasn't even able to score 2.5 million, which means that he's under the 5 million kind of average that a character would get if they don't have a damage proc. If the character is good, they would easily score close to 6 million without a damage proc, which Surfer doesn't get close to. The rotation that I use for the character is to quick cancel the first and second skill to fill up the ultimate faster, and the base rotation would be 3, cancel 4, cancel 5. When you have your ultimate, you basically want to use that first, and delay cancel it after you see him throw the energy orb or whatever it is in the air, and then you can begin the rotation again, which is 3, cancel 4, cancel 5. You can use the tier 4 skill whenever it's available, but again you can see another instance of the character not being great for PvE, since it took me nearly 5 minutes to solo this fight, whereas for another character with these same conditions, I would be able to do it in 4 minutes or less. So you can see that his PvE performance isn't really that great, but what he's lacking in PvE, he makes up for in PvP content. Instead of just jumping straight into the T4 testing for the character, I wanted to show people just how good he is even at level 70 and not even level 80. Keep in mind that I'm using a Brilliant Authority on my build, so that is definitely a factor in his performance, but even if you don't have a Brilliant, he is very strong in PvP. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, one of the main benefits from his new uniform is that they've resolved the kind of issues that he had with his AI rotation. Previously, he would just rotate through skills like 1, 2, and sometimes the 5th skill, and wouldn't really use the 3rd skill unless the opponent went into an iframe, and even then, sometimes the counter effect wouldn't really activate. With this new uniform, he basically opens with the 3rd skill always, so he hits the opponent because now that has a damage portion at the start of it, and then if he gets hit when that skill is active, he'll also activate the counter portion in it, and usually that's enough to one-shot the opponent. He still struggles versus opponents that have long iframes or very high burst damage, so that would be characters like Wolverine that hide in the 5th skill iframe for a very long time, or Adam Warlock that has the very high burst damage from the 2nd skill. But despite that, you can see that the character is basically soloing full T4 teams, or ones that are nearly all T4 characters, simply by being at level 70 and having 2 health supports, which aren't even the best options you could have for supports there, since there are ones like Colossus or Shuri that not only reduce damage but also increase damage to the opponent. The other clear benefits with his new uniform is that he has much higher survivability. He now gains 5 seconds of invincible on his 4th skill, which he previously didn't have in his kit, as well as a decently long full iframe on his 5th skill, which he also didn't have in his kit. He also gains more healing on his 3rd skill, which now activates when the 3rd skill is used, not when it's countered, which makes a huge difference for his healing. And he also gains 10% additional damage reduction on his passive, which makes a significant difference when you're considering his build options. Besides Surfer's AI now prioritizing the 3rd skill, he'll usually follow up with the 4th skill and 5th skill after that, so he's either invincible or hiding in full iframes, and if he gets caught out of those, then he usually does the 3rd skill, which frequently will activate the counter effect since he's being hit at that time, and usually leads to a one-shot or the opponent dying shortly after from reflect. His offense is also greatly improved. Not only does he deal more damage through reflect because of the higher values on his passive, but the 4th skill also lingers on and can still hit the opponent if he gets interrupted, and the same thing goes for the 5th skill. Even if he gets interrupted or ends up dying, those skills can potentially take out the opponent. It's also worth noting that the damage accumulation being moved to the 5th skill rather than the 3rd skill is significant, because now as soon as he activates the 5th skill, he'll start charging up that meter fairly quickly because of the number of hits and damage that the 5th skill does, whereas previously it being on the 3rd skill, if the 3rd skill counter effect didn't activate, he wouldn't start charging up the meter much, and even if it did, it didn't have that many hits, so it wouldn't really fill up too quickly. With it being on the 5th, it charges up much faster and gives him much more damage across pretty much all of his skills now. Again, you can see just how good the character is even at level 70 on full auto. He was able to beat my full timeline team that all have brilliant CTPs and 6-star artifacts. He beat a Jean that had a brilliant authority, Wolverine with a brilliant greed, and Madeline with a brilliant authority. When you get the character to tier 4, he's basically just a nightmare to the opponent. He gains even more reflect damage, not only because of the higher health that you get from the tier 4 stat bump, but also because you gain more energy damage on top of that, so you're harder to kill, while also dealing more damage just purely from reflect, not to mention the damage that he deals from his skills 3, 4, and 5. Silver Surfer's high survivability increasing further with the tier 4 stat bump means that the character can often reach that tier 4 skill, which makes him even more potent offensively because you have access to the striker, which can make a big difference, but he also gains additional healing from the tier 4, which makes him even more of a problem because he'll be even tankier and again deal more reflect damage on top of damage that he deals himself. Because Silver Surfer's offensive capabilities are so closely tied to survivability, i.e. the reflect damage, I would say that his best build option across the majority of the PvP modes is to build him tanky or for survival, and one of his most ideal build options is a Steel CTP of Authority. Because the character now has 40% damage reduction in his kit passively as opposed to the 30% from before, if you're able to get a brilliant Steel Authority with 60% damage reduction, you can effectively make him immortal for 5 seconds, which normally would be pretty good for most characters because you want that extra survival to be able to take out the opponent. But if you're immortal with Silver Surfer and you're reflecting damage back to them, it makes a massive difference offensively for the character as well as defensively. Besides the Steel proc, you also gain a little bit of extra survivability from the 5 seconds on the bottom proc, but more importantly, you gain that additional damage from the bottom proc that also helps with the reflect. This is why I'd say that a Steel Authority, even if it is a mighty one, is his most ideal option. You could also go with something like a CTP of Conquest, though the bottom proc or the wall proc doesn't activate nearly as much as the Steel proc due to the timers on it. The CTP of Conquest is more offensive driven, I would say, because the top proc activates the damage part more often. However, you can make him tankier depending on the supports that you use. So the main split between the Steel Authority and the CTP of Conquest is that the Steel Authority allows the character to be more standalone. It's not so dependent on supports, whereas the CTP of Conquest can potentially have a higher survivability, but it is more dependent on the team that you use and the supports that you pair up with Silver Surfer. The character can work with a CTP of Refinement or a CTP of Regen, but I wouldn't recommend it over an Authority or a Conquest because the Regen and Refinement don't have any damage associated with them, so even though it improves his survivability, the other CTPs improve his survivability while also giving him a damage increase, which also helps his reflect even more. You're more than likely going to have some issues encountering him in timeline, so here are some tips and strats that you can use to basically take him down easily. One of them is that you can use Madeline with the Immortal Artifact and just move away from his first attack, even if you do end up burning the first effect, and just use the second skill to burst him down and whatever other skills to take out his first life. After that, you just switch to another character like Spider-Man or Wolverine and use a high burst iframe skill or iframe ignore skill to take out his second life. An even easier strat that you can use is just to switch to a reflect character right off the start to burn Silver Surfer's first life, and then you can switch to a character like Adam and immediately go into the third skill followed by the fifth skill to take out Surfer's second life while also hiding from his reflect damage in your own iframes. If the timing on that is tricky for you, you can open up with Adam Warlock and switch to a character like Emma or Ancient One for the first reflect, and then switch to Surfer for a little bit of the second reflect, and when the opponent Silver Surfer starts attacking, immediately go into your third skill to take him out. The last option is the trickiest in terms of timing and doesn't always work, but you can potentially take out both of Silver Surfer's lives with Emma. The first life you can take out just by switching to her when Surfer uses his third skill, and then after he dies, you move away to the opposite side of the arena, and you'll see Surfer coming towards you. As soon as you see him stop, you pretty much move towards him and activate the fourth skill. This will proc the invincible effect on Emma and give her just enough survival to survive the third skill while you're reflecting damage back to Surfer and potentially killing him before you end up dying. As for playing the character on manual, you essentially just want to use the fourth skill whenever you have it available, wait for the opponent to react, and immediately use the third skill there. It will guarantee that you use the counter on the third skill and essentially one-shot the opponent. When both the third and fourth skill are on cooldown, you just want to stay in the fifth skill to hide from damage and potentially fill up your steal proc if the opponent is hitting you with iframe ignores. With the character having 2 lives, large AoE damage that lingers after he dies, iframe ignore, and reflect, it's pretty much guaranteed that he will be one of the top picks for things like Otherworld Battle, especially this season where alien characters have increased damage. You can see from this clip that with the use of Surfer at the start of the fight, I was essentially able to ace the opponent and didn't end up losing a single character for my team. It's possible that the opponent will use a Ghost Rider to counter Surfer on your team, since Surfer is now a villain type and Ghost Rider has a massive damage increase versus him. One of the strats I used to avoid him one-shotting Surfer is to have Surfer just spawn on the other side of the arena so that Ghost Rider will have to close the gap, and in that time Surfer will use his third skill to burn the first life, supposedly, of Ghost Rider and potentially just interrupt his iframe ignore skill, and then he'll basically just be using his regular attacks and Surfer can reflect that damage back to Ghost Rider, and you'll basically just avoid the outright counter for Surfer right there. However, as you can see from this clip, if you want to potentially counter an opponent's Surfer, Ghost Rider is also a good option, but you would have to make sure that his starting position is right beside Surfer so that you can use that iframe ignore right away and just kill him immediately. Not too many people have access to Alliance Tournament. This is kind of what it looks like. I actually hadn't seen it before till I played it last week. But in that mode, the character definitely is holding up to a degree. It's kind of hard to say now because it really depends on the builds and RNG and things like that. So you can't really tell unless you have a lot of testing. But I was able to win my first fight, so there's that. And depending on the ban list, he's definitely going to be one of the options on those weeks that top characters like Jean, Wolverine, and Adam are banned. Naturally, the character will also be meta in Alliance Conquest, and you don't really need much to make him work. As you can see from this clip, all I had was Red She-Hulk for the additional health, and I was able to beat both Doom and Adam Warlock with a Wong support. By simply adding in another functional character, like Rachel Summers with her Awakening skill, this team can now take out one of the top teams, if not the top team for Alliance Conquest, which consists of Molecule Man, Wolverine, and Adam Warlock. Because Silver Surfer also has the symbiote tag now, it's possible that the opponent will also use Carnage and Agent Venom to boost out both characters, so one of the things you can do is just use Silver Surfer yourself to counter it, and just add in 2 supports to exceed the 1 support that the opponent has. You'll often take out at least one of the lives for Surfer, and leave just Carnage with support left over if you do end up failing. However, if you want a more consistent counter, I would say that Wolverine is the best option to take out Silver Surfer Carnage sets, since he is a natural counter to Surfer himself and does well versus Carnage too. Because Molecule Man doesn't really affect Agent Venom's support, you can't use him as a leadership, so one of the options that I used instead was Kang. I found him really effective if you use a support as the third option, or potentially even a reflect character to take out Surfer's first life and kind of interrupt any of the attacks or damage that both Surfer and Carnage do off the start, since Kang usually opens up with his own iframe counter. You can see another instance of this where Kang immediately opens up with the iframe ignore counter off the start to knock the opponents out of their skills, and then Wolverine just does a massive amount of damage with his fifth skill to wipe them out quickly. Another team that I ended up testing was Ghost Rider with supports, and this is a good team for at least taking out one of Surfer's lives as well as potentially Carnage. However, the cooldowns on Ghost Rider's skills don't align too well with Surfer, and he will more than likely end up losing to Surfer's second life. So you'd need either potentially a slightly different team or a strong second team to be able to take out a solo Surfer. Depending on the characters that the opponent teams with Surfer, you can counter accordingly. If they have a support that can be nullified by Molecule Man, you can use his leadership. If they use Wolverine, you can use Adam Warlock and activate the first instance of Wolverine's Immortal artifact, as well as potentially take out the first life of Surfer. And then Spider-Man is always a good option, even though the bonus to villain damage is nullified by Molecule Man too. He does have that ignored damage reduction, which works really well since most times Surfer will have either supports or have that steel proc, which Spider-Man will ignore and potentially take out the second life. As you can see, Surfer is now a top 3 contender for PvP across all modes, and will likely replace Jean Grey in Timeline because she gets countered so easily by Reflect. Madeline is also a top contender for the top 3 spot, and it really depends on who is banned for particular weeks, but it is important to note that if you end up going into Challenger, Madeline doesn't really have any value there, or presence really, because the Immortal artifact is completely nullified in Challenger. So for that reason, Surfer is actually one of the top picks for Challenger mode specifically. Inversely, I'd say that Madeline has more value in Alliance Conquest because the character doesn't disappear from a zone unless they have fully died, whereas Surfer only needs to die once to disappear from the fight, and you could potentially cheese that with certain characters that have awakenings, for example, to take out just one of his lives. With that said, the character can definitely be difficult to deal with due to his reflect, and can potentially hold zones in Alliance Conquest depending on the characters or teams that you use him with. He's arguably in the top 3 spot now across all of Timeline, regardless of the ranking that you're at, and will essentially be featured in all Otherworld Battle teams unless he has a penalty or is soft banned on particular weeks. Silver Surfer is now one of the few characters in the game and the best character in the game to fully auto Timeline teams. All you really need is 1 or 2 supports, and he can take out entire teams by himself, including characters like Adam Warlock and Wolverine that so many characters struggle versus. I know that many people are burned out on tier 4 materials, including myself, but luckily for Silver Surfer, all you really need is his uniform. You don't even really need his artifact, and the character will do very well in Timeline and other PvP modes just with that. That essentially summarizes Silver Surfer. He got the much needed upgrade that he deserved, though he is lacking in PvE, which is unfortunate, but at least his PvP performance is so dominant. So if you care about PvP at all, then I would highly advise just picking up his uniform to start off with. I put a lot of effort into this one, so if you did enjoy it, please consider liking and subscribing and potentially sharing it with others. It can help them out, and it also helps my channel grow. As always, I appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you, but the video is now over.